What's up, everybody? We have 10-ish minutes here with Mark to my left, and this is Jimmy actually bringing you a 10-minute talk. So I was so excited about this one and excited about our guest. This is Chris Urrutia, right?
Threw a
little R in there.
Simon, yeah.
Who is one of the instructors down at Vortex EDGE. If you've been wondering where I've been at, it's been primarily at Vortex EDGE, getting all that stuff going. You should go check it out.
Very much alive.
Very much alive.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Yeah, Mark.
Proof of life right here.
Yeah. You brought up this idea for the topic, which is triggers and their shapes.
Yes.
Yes, curved versus flat.
We've been triggered once again, Jim. No, I mean, right now we've got 10 minutes to answer one of life's greatest questions.
Maybe.
I mean, I don't know if this is a chicken egg thing or what, but flat versus curved triggers, really, and it's not just ARs, it's pistols, it's bolt guns. They're really available, and sometimes it seems like it comes down to personal preference, but it does seem like there's some application-specific things in relation to it.
And Chris pulls, or if you're an instructor, you'd probably say presses to the rear, a lot of triggers. So, Chris,
you could say that.
We're going to talk real generally here. If anybody wants to hear more on anything specifically, because we got some pistols on the table, we got a rifle, a carbine on the table. You see curved and flat triggers all over the place. So let us know if you want to dive further in on this specifically sometime in the future. But, Chris, kind of talk to us about curved versus flat triggers across the board. You even have different preferences depending on the platform.
Yep, absolutely. I started shooting and learned everything I know at the beginning on curved triggers. So I didn't know any different, right? When I first got my Mark 18 back in 2013, that's basically all I ran personally. And then every work gun, everything I've ever been issued had a curved trigger in it.
Right, all the like USGI triggers and carbines and stuff, all curved.
Right. So when I invested in my own upgrade for this rifle, I went with a Geisel SS AE, right? And like you mentioned, in carbines, I prefer curved triggers because that's just what I'm used to. And honestly, I've yet to find something in a flat profile that is as good as this broken in beat up SSAE. So that's why I still have that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Now on the pistol side, because it's typically for me a longer trigger pull, I tend to prefer flat face triggers. I feel like it gives me more of a mechanical advantage to get through that trigger break a lot cleanly. And yeah, that's just a personal preference of mine.
Okay, got it. So in that case, I guess the SS, that AE, that is a single stage.
No, it's
right?
it's a two-stage trigger. It's just it's the difference between this and like a typical SSA and an SSAE. Oh. It's enhanced, and for me it just breaks a lot cleaner.
Oh, okay.
And it's just honestly, it's one of the nicest triggers I've ever had on any one of my ARs. In fact, it with the exception of like a Mark 12 build, I have that trigger in all of my ARs.
Yeah.
So
now, when it comes to the curved shape of that on a carbine, so you're saying you still get less overall travel on the trigger than in comparison to a pistol like the Glock that you use. So then, does that come into play? It sounds like
a little bit. And like I said, I've got so much time and rounds on this thing that it's broken in really nice. In fact, it has very little pre-travel at all.
Oh,
you know what I mean? But when you come over here to the pistol side, on something like a stock Gen 5, let's say, it's a very nice trigger. Don't get me wrong. If you bought this and this is what you ran, good on you. It's a great trigger. However, I find it just a tad easier to gain a mechanical advantage depending on where I put my finger, and just get through that trigger pull a little more smooth, if you will, especially when in terms of just shooting tight groups.
Yeah. So the stock trigger on this Glock Gen 5 is a curved trigger,
right?
But then you went aftermarket and put in a flat.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Especially on something like my competition gun, I just feel like for me this Timney flat face breaks a little smoother. I feel like I'm able to decide where I get to apply the pressure and get a cleaner, almost smoother break, as opposed with the flat face trigger, which basically just the part that I've got my finger sitting on just sits a little further. So I'm getting more of a mechanical advantage on it. You know what I mean?
What about finding the trigger itself, a flat versus a curved, or at least finding where you want to be on the trigger? Is that easier? Like maybe you're trying, you're doing like you're drawing your pistol or something like that. Is there an advantage with a flat versus a curved, or vice versa?
I tend to think of it in terms of feel, right? So again, great trigger from Glock, and in fact, there's curvature in not just the shape, but also the profile of the trigger itself. So the Gen 4s were rounded, had more of a rounded feel. So not only was it curved, but it was rounded, right? Whereas like something like this is my work gun. I have this Apex on here. It has a far larger and flatter profile.
It's sharper angles.
Right, exactly. And even with this Timney, you can see that there's no curvature. It's just like almost a 90 degree. It goes flat on the front surface, and then it just goes right into a 90 degree. There's no curvature there.
Yeah.
For me, that allows me to just get a repeatable feel on where my finger reacts and interacts with the trigger. So for me, it's just about repeatability and knowing that once the gun's in my hand, this is where, and you can see I've kind of got calluses everywhere, but I know where that trigger is going to go. Whereas with a curved trigger, I don't feel like you really have those reference points.
Okay, yeah,
so
as consistent.
Right, exactly. So not only do I prefer a flat shaped trigger, but I also, even if it's curved, I still like to go with something that has a flatter profile, like that you see there. Yeah. I mean, you can still see some rounding on there, so you can get pretty consistent with it. But something like that's completely rounded, yeah. Even like this curved trigger, you see it still has a flat face on it.
Yeah. So as an instructor, how important is it for you that yourself and students that come through at Vortex Edge, how important is it to you that they have consistent placement of their trigger finger on the trigger every time? Why is it important that it's the same always?
I think, let me back up. I think a lot of people will put a lot of emphasis on what this finger is doing. It's very important, don't get me wrong. But in terms of like if I'm shooting a carbine, to me, and this is just my opinion, I think it matters more what your body's doing and how your shoulder's relating to the gun, because I have more of an ability to affect the shot with all of this as opposed to just what this is doing, right?
Okay.
So and now with handgun, it's a handgun. So if my focus is on what this is doing as opposed to what the other like 60 or so muscle groups involved in my grip are doing, then I've kind of got my focus in the wrong place, right? I like to think and run my pistols more with hand focus and grip focus rather than really getting away with a lot of imperfections in my trigger pull.
Yeah,
right.
Is it important? Yes, in a hierarchy of things affecting the shot, maybe a little bit down the list.
Right, exactly. For me personally, right. I'm going to put more of an emphasis on what my support hand is doing versus just like ensuring that my trigger is sitting on this groove or on this point of my trigger finger every time I pull the trigger. Especially like when I'm doing something like USPSA, right? I just don't have the time to draw and ensure that I'm grabbing the trigger right before I break those first couple shots. It's just cognitively I don't, and if I invest that into an actual conscious thought, then I'm doing everything else wrong.
Well, that's probably where maybe some of the different trigger shapes, though, can help. Because if it has some level of importance, it's not just completely, doesn't matter. If it has some level of importance and there's like a subconscious thing with feel that can get you there, I'd have to imagine that helps. Whereas if you're just kind of throwing your finger onto a trigger where it's a little bit more vague and you can't quite it's...
I think for me, if I know what this gun should feel like in my hand, and that I'm getting my trigger finger somewhat in the same place every single time, or at least in the general zip code, then I know I'm good to go. I can start setting shots. Where the problem is, if I don't have like a good, like say this trigger was rounded, right? Then I have the ability to almost maybe to put too much trigger, and understanding what that does, right? It's pulling my hand kind of out of alignment, and where ideally I want my grip built. Right.
Almost like if you got your finger too deep,
then it's physically
like torque.
Right, exactly. So whereas if I have too little grip, then that's doing something else to my hand, right? To me, it's about just the first reference point is my hand, just making sure my hand's set on the gun properly, and then once that's built, just a result and one of the cool features of having a flat face trigger is that you have a bigger reference point to just match your finger to, and now I know that I'm good to go. I know that physically I have less ability to throw shots down range. And that's why on pistols, at least, I prefer the flat.
So it seems to me an awful lot like before you start agonizing over which shape trigger you have, you should really make sure that your body, your hands, and everything else is doing the right stuff. And almost the rest of it, as far as where the trigger finger is and what it's doing will kind of start to fall into place.
Yeah. Yes.
Because, I mean, especially what you were describing there, I mean, it made total sense. If your trigger finger's too far in, then your wrist is kind of coming around the gun, whereas if your trigger finger's too far out, it's going to kind of force your...
Right.
That's probably indicative that your wrist is kind of, not in the right spot either. But it all just should naturally sort of fall into place.
Right. If I have a student who's shooting lights out in the prone, right, there's very little possibility for this finger to affect a prone shot unless like you're doing something else. Now, if I stand that same student up and they're throwing everything low left with a rifle, then I'm like, let me take your magazine. I'm going to empty your chamber. Now shoot the gun, and then inevitably you'll see the flinch. That really doesn't start with the trigger finger. It starts with everything else, right?
Right.
So before, like you said, before you agonize on which trigger, do I go flat? Do I go? Just make sure that on a very fundamental level that you're understanding what your body is doing and what you require of your body to start landing good shots. And then you can start getting into, well, how much trigger pull do I need? What kind of profile trigger should I get into? And then all that stuff. It's like folks that pick one gun versus another because it feels a certain way. Well, make sure you're holding it right before you make that kind of a decision. It's the same thing. Before you start adjusting trigger pulls and thinking about types of trigger, make sure you're physically doing good things.
We talk about so many things here, Jim, and they're all great topics, but so many times it circles back to fundamentals and mechanics. All things that you can learn over at Vortex EDGE.
It's true.
Absolutely.
It's true. I mean, how much of what we talk about is even, I mean, this is a little bit off topic, but we talk so much about like accuracy and optics and rifle scopes and sighting things in properly, making sure you have a properly sighted in rifle, and hanging out with these guys more at Vortex EDGE. I've realized that more often than not, there's a lot of people out there making adjustments to gear in order to fix something that actually was never broken. It was actually something that they were doing. And it's really hard to tell somebody that because it can oftentimes be like I mean, how hard is it to just usually go up to somebody? I mean, unless you're from maybe like New York, right, Chris?
I don't know what you're talking about.
You go up to somebody and just say, hey, you're wrong.
Yeah.
But,
it's not me, it's you.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, how many people, Chris, that are adjusting their scopes up and to the right because they keep shooting low and left,
Right.
and actually the gun was sighted in and the scope was sighted in. It was them pushing stuff low and left.
Yeah.
So same thing goes for the trigger. I think I see it a lot of times. People are like, well, I'm not shooting right because of this trigger. Oh, man, it's the trigger. And, well, there might be some other stuff there.
Might be some more of again. The visualization I give people that I teach is it takes about a little over 6 muscle groups to do this. It takes about 60 to hold something. You know what I mean?
Right.
So in terms of a tug of war, who's really in control there? So if I can get you to do things physically with your hands and in the case with the carbine with your upper body and your shoulder, then you're going to be in a better place to make a more informed decision, I think, on a trigger.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
With the carbine, it's like you definitely prefer the curved, right? But that's kind of what you're more familiar with it. Like, so you just like things that you're more familiar with. Are there arguments, in the plus or minus category about what, I guess, the pros and cons of each?
Yeah, I think I've seen the arguments being made for, again, the reset and having mechanical advantage physically over the fulcrum point on a trigger being flat versus running something that's curved. And that just goes back to the positioning of where the material are and how you're interacting with it, right? But I mean, again, that's on a trigger by trigger basis. Like on this LaRue flat faced, I mean, you can see like just where it's built onto the trigger body. It's going to be a little different than where it is on the Geisel on a flat face trigger. So, I mean, you can literally go either way. I know guys that run these some of our instructors down there run these at a very, very high level. It's just, again, I've been running this so long, and this has been broken in so much that you can't convince me that
it's polished itself.
Right, exactly.
So,
it's kind of taking care of itself at this point.
So I'm going to ask about a properly broken trigger. I'm wearing a real broken pair of shoes right now, Jim.
Oh yeah, and a set of jeans. Those look nicely broken.
Oh yes, exactly. Very comfortable. But I'm going to back up, and maybe there's something here across the board. Maybe there's nothing here across the board. Does a flat versus curved create or reduce overall space in the trigger well or trigger guard? Like, maybe, I wear gloves all the time, or maybe, it's likely I'm going to be in some colder conditions and I want to wear a heavier glove, will one give or take away more space in there?
I've seen it physically to where like this stock Glock trigger can sit a little further forward in the trigger guard, whereas you can see the amount of clearance I have with this Timney and with this Apex. I mean, you get a little more there, right? So, and I've definitely heard people make that argument where you just have a little more room, maybe they're available to you if you're wearing something thicker like a glove.
Okay.
Especially like in Wisconsin here, you know, what is it, like 8 degrees out right now?
Little, yeah. It was
Yeah.
a little,
It'll be 60 in a couple days, but then it'll be back
Oh
to
yeah, but
8
that's
again.
neither
Yeah.
here nor there, right?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. But no, yeah, I've seen that argument being made. I mean, I still run what I run, understanding that, you know, in my carbines I expect to have the flat face or the rounded feel, and then I got flatter triggers on my pistols.
Cool. So I know this is more of a versus, you know, A or B, but you've brought it up a couple times. So like, what define a properly or just an awesomely broken trigger for me? Like, you're obviously like really digging this trigger right now and for a long time. So what's going on there?
When I first got it, I liked it. It was great. But when I take this same SSAE and compare it to others, like new out the box, there's a noticeable difference. I think it's just in how the sear and the parts internally are kind of interacting with each other. Like those surfaces have probably started to wear themselves out to where I have to apply less pressure to the trigger to get that disengagement, right?
They're kind of like, you know, when you first get married and there's all that friction because you're sort of like, man, I didn't realize, you know, you folded your socks that way. Yeah, you know, and then after a while, you kind of just work these things out to the point where, you know, you just don't have as many of these arguments.
Yep, the parts are getting along better.
They are. They've been living together for a long enough period of time. They've sort of settled their differences.
They get each other.
Yeah, they do.
Whereas, you know, in some of these newer triggers, there's the feeding out process.
It's like an arranged marriage of parts.
Right.
It's like, we don't know if you're going to get along, but
here you go.
Yeah,
here you go. Yeah.
Well, I can't speak for Geisley, or as Chris says, Geisel. Who knows what it actually is? I can't speak for them. Maybe they do precision match them, but you know.
I'm just glad you didn't have to divorce your trigger.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
It'd be messy. I need a good lawyer for that. But anyway, so okay, that's a little bit of a rundown. You know, we've taken up a good amount of this 10-minute talk speaking about that, but we'd love to hear out there what triggers you guys prefer. If you're listening, drop us a comment either on Instagram or on YouTube if you're watching there. What kind of triggers do you prefer and where? Also, was there anything why was there anything we missed in talking about triggers and their various shapes that you'd like us to go into further? Maybe we can talk about this more with some more Edge instructors. Chris is one of 6, so at least at the time of this recording. I'm not implying anything, by the way. Our 6 instructors, you know, I plan to have 6.
All right.
Yeah, not less.
Yeah, it's not a pink slip.
Did it just get on here?
Surprise.
So, yeah, we'd love to hear from you guys. And cool.
Flat or curved? Let us know.
All right.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
guys.